they had been trapped in the brutal grind of trench warfare. The Red Army battalion was on the verge of collapse. They had no tanks, no artillery, and their positions were constantly haunted by German snipers. The situation grew even more desperate when their only hope for reinforcements vanished. A convoy of Soviet troops had been completely wiped out by German aircraft. Only a handful of soldiers survived, among them a young hunter from Yakutia, Siberia, named Yegor Chirin. This story is inspired by a real Soviet sniper named Sirendashi Dorjiev, a hunter from the Siberian taiga who reportedly took down more than 300 enemy soldiers during World War II, even managing to shoot down a German fighter plane. One morning, a lieutenant peered through his binoculars, scanning the foggy horizon. Beside him, a young sniper silently adjusted his rifle, searching for a target. But before they could fire, the tables turned, and they became the hunted. The sniper, Guryanov, claimed to know where the enemy was hiding, but the position was impossible to reach. He asked permission to use the machine gun to suppress the Germans across the field, but his lieutenant refused. The German side had already taken out several of their best Soviet marksmen. Far from the trenches, a line of Soviet trucks rolled slowly under a gray, heavy sky. The dull clouds suddenly burst with streaks of fire as a German Messerschmitt dived from above. The scene erupted into chaos. One truck swerved into the trees trying to escape. Amid the panic, one soldier, Yegor, stood his ground and fired back into the sky. That shot marked the beginning of his legend, Siberian sniper. That night, the surviving soldiers finally reached the front lines and crawled into the trenches. In his bunker, Lieutenant Loboda reported to his major that the scout team sent out 3 days ago had not returned. Only one marksman remained, Guryanov. The front was locked in a stalemate. 2 long months had passed with no reinforcements from division headquarters. The new platoon that had just arrived was painfully small. An old sergeant major entered the room and informed them that only 4 soldiers from the latest platoon had survived the German airstrike. None of them were trained marksmen. That was a problem for Major Belyaev, who needed a sniper and a recon squad to investigate the crash site of the Messerschmitt that had gone down the previous evening. The next morning, the fresh soldiers were ordered to dig new trenches. As Chirin worked, he heard a familiar tune echoing from a nearby bunker. It was a traditional Yakut song, sung by a man named Nikolai, who was joking with his comrades. Chirin stepped inside, introduced himself, and to Nikolai's delight, he realized he had just met another Yakut from Siberia. Outside, the sergeant major overheard from one of Chirin's comrades that it was Chirin who had shot at the German Messerschmitt the day before. No one really knew if his shot had actually hit the plane. Soon after, Chirin was summoned from the bunker and brought before Lieutenant Loboda, who asked why he hadn't reported the incident. Chirin simply replied that he wasn't sure whether his bullet had really struck the target. To test him, the lieutenant took Chirin out to the training field. He wanted to see the young man's skills for himself. Chirin aimed carefully and fired, but one of his shots landed just above the heart on the target. The lieutenant pointed it out, yet Chirin calmly explained that in a real battle, no enemy stands upright. They crouch or crawl, so his bullet would have hit the heart in a real fight. His logic made perfect sense, and it was enough to convince Lieutenant Loboda of his ability. Then came the confirmation. The German Messerschmitt that Chirin had fired on had crashed just 2 miles from camp. The wreck showed no sign of other bullets, except for one that had pierced the pilot's body. Against all odds, Chirin's single shot had brought down the plane. Back in the trenches, the ground suddenly shook with explosions. One terrified soldier lost control, climbed out of the trench, and started shouting like a madman. He had no idea that a German MG-42 and a sniper named Schultz were waiting for such a mistake. Chirin was quickly called in order to eliminate the machine gun crew when they paused to reload. He was given Guryanov's scope. Without hesitation, Chirin removed his helmet, took position, and fired with incredible precision. Each shot hit its mark. The German gunners fell one by one before Schultz could even react. Watching from behind, Guryanov realized just how skilled Chirin truly was. Meanwhile, in the German trenches, Schultz was stunned. He thought every Soviet sniper had already been wiped out. The death of his machine gun team reached Lieutenant Colonel Rulik, who decided not to retaliate too quickly. He knew that a hasty move could backfire. The Soviets had a way of turning desperation into deadly traps. Rulik remembered the spring of 1942, when the Germans had stormed the Soviet lines expecting little resistance, only to be met with endless waves of Red Army soldiers. That memory kept him cautious now. He would not risk another reckless mistake. On the Soviet side, Lieutenant Loboda assigned a new mission to Chirin and Guryanov, to hunt down a German artillery spotter hidden deep in the forest. Not long after, 2 familiar figures appeared at camp. Lieutenant Shigurov and Sergeant Ponomarev, the scouts who had been missing for days, finally returned. But the news they carried was grim. Headquarters would send no tanks, no reinforcements. The only order left for the men at the front was simple: hold the line and survive. A new problem soon came to light. After investigating the wreck, they discovered that the downed German Messerschmitt had carried only 10 minutes worth of fuel. That could only mean one thing. There was a hidden German airstrip somewhere near the forest. No one knew exactly where, but it was clear that the Germans were slowly building up their strength, preparing for a full-scale encirclement of the Soviet lines. Before the day ended, Loboda couldn't help but comment on Shigurov's long beard. Shigurov only laughed it off, saying it was part of his disguise as a scout. He promised to shave it only when the entire campaign was over. That night, inside the German bunker, Schultz examined a helmet that had been struck by Chirin's bullet. He explained to his commander that the machine gun squad had been taken out by a single sniper in a rapid, precise attack. When asked if the shooter was a professional, Schultz replied that there were no trained marksmen in Russia, only local hunters who understood the land better than anyone else. Back in the Soviet trenches, Lieutenant Loboda handed Chirin a wristwatch for his next mission. Chirin prepared to move out as Ivan reminded him that he would give the signal at 6 in the morning. In the darkness, Chirin and Guryanov crawled through the wet grass toward their target. By dawn, they were in position. From the trench, Ivan pushed forward his machine gun barrel to fire the signal shot. Chirin ordered Guryanov to hold position while he crept ahead to scout. The moment the gunfire echoed, the German troops were instantly on alert. Among them was the artillery spotter, the one Chirin had been sent to eliminate. But things didn't go as planned. Guryanov's shot missed badly, and the noise gave away their position. German soldiers under Schultz's command fired back, not realizing that Chirin had already slipped close to the enemy's observation hole. There, he engaged the spotter in a deadly one-on-one fight. When night fell again, Guryanov returned to the trenches and admitted he had lost contact with Chirin. Moments later, Chirin emerged from the dark, dragging the wounded German spotter behind him like a hunter returning from the wild. The prisoner was interrogated by Chirin's comrade, the same unstable soldier from earlier, who surprisingly turned out to be a good translator. From the interrogation, they learned that the Germans had a dedicated sniper squad led by Schultz, and more importantly, that their artillery and tanks were gone. The next morning, Guryanov was visibly shaken by his failure. He spent hours practicing his aim until Chirin approached him, patiently offering advice and sharing his own shooting techniques. Later, both men reported to Ivanov, the political officer sent by the Communist Party to oversee the troops. Impressed by Chirin's success, Ivanov offered him a reward, but Chirin asked for nothing more than a small mirror. Meanwhile, at division headquarters, a heated argument broke out. A colonel scolded his major for requesting tanks just to drive off a single German platoon. The major defended his decision, saying the prisoner's intel suggested that the Germans were preparing an encirclement, moving platoon by platoon from the east to surround the Soviet front. The colonel, however, refused to believe it, at least not until he could hear the report himself from Lieutenant Shigurov. Night fell once again. Chirin reported to Lieutenant Loboda, who had made a new decision. This time, Chirin would be assigned to a reconnaissance mission under Lieutenant Ponomarev's squad. Their task was to cross the German front lines and hide behind enemy positions. Out in the cold night, Sergeant Ponomarev gathered his men and briefed them on the mission. He and Chirin would lead the way, clearing a path through the minefield ahead. Once they were free of the mines, the squad pushed deeper into German territory. The guards were careless, unaware that Soviet scouts were moving right under their noses. After slipping past the trenches, they disappeared into the forest. When morning came, the journey was far from over. They reached a bridge that had been recently rebuilt by the Germans, a clear sign that armored reinforcements were on the way. The squad needed to get closer to assess the situation. Ponomarev moved ahead carefully, the world around them silent and still. But hidden among the trees, Schultz was already watching. Moments later, the silence shattered as German rifles opened fire. Caught off guard, Chirin's inexperience showed. He had forgotten how deep they were behind enemy lines. As bullets tore through the air, he fought to stay composed, scanning for Schultz's position, while his comrades fell one by one. Only after losing 2 men did he finally locate his enemy's nest. Using the small mirror he'd been given earlier, Chirin lifted it just above the grass, pretending to peek. Schultz took the bait. The German sniper fired, revealing his location. Chirin adjusted, took aim, and pulled the trigger. The shot found its mark, but his victory was short-lived. As he crawled forward, his foot pressed down on a hidden mine. The explosion threw him to the ground, and everything went black. Hours later, Chirin awoke in German captivity. He was brought before Lieutenant Colonel Rulik for interrogation. Outside, the Germans had set up large speakers facing the Soviet trenches, broadcasting propaganda music. Without realizing it, Chirin's voice was being recorded through a microphone in the same room. The Germans, exhausted by years of brutal fighting, hoped to break Soviet morale. They wanted the Red Army to surrender without a fight. Rulik used Chirin as an example, showing how well Soviet prisoners were treated. Naively, Chirin believed it, even asking for his favorite biscuits. But there was a condition. He had to speak into the microphone, telling the Red Army how kindly he'd been treated. When his voice echoed across the front lines, he said what they wanted to hear. Yet instead of Russian, he switched to his native Yakut language, sending a hidden message to his comrades that his entire squad had been wiped out at the newly rebuilt bridge. The Germans didn't understand a word. Rulich thought the recording was harmless, but Chirin's message had slipped through, a warning disguised as innocence. Soon after, he was thrown into a cold, dark bunker without the biscuits he had been promised. Hungry and alone, Chirin sat in silence. But there was one thing he could take pride in. Even as a prisoner, he had acted with the courage and cunning of a true Soviet soldier. In another room, Rulik met with Schultz, who had somehow survived. He praised Schultz for wiping out Ponomarev's squad, but Schultz humbly admitted his mistake, still embarrassed that he had fallen for the mirror trick used by the enemy sniper. Rulik ordered him to bring Chirin back for further questioning. But when the guards opened the cell door, Chirin seized the moment. In a split second of distraction, he broke free and vanished into the thick, dark forest. On the Soviet side, Lieutenant Shigurov turned to Nikolai, asking about the Yakut message Chirin had sent earlier. Nikolai explained that the message revealed the failure of Sergeant Ponomarev's mission and confirmed that Chirin had been captured by the Germans. What they didn't know was that Chirin had already escaped. By morning, the Germans had launched a full-scale search. Dogs were sent out to track him. Meanwhile, Chirin made his way to the riverbank, near the area where his squad had fallen. He knew he had to cross back through German lines to return to his own side. Along the way, he found a mortar shell and then heard the distant roar of engines. Through the mist, he saw a convoy of German panzers rumbling forward, their outlines fading in and out of the fog. Before he could react, several men appeared from the trees, guns aimed at his back. Chirin was captured once again, but this time it wasn't by the Germans. These were local partisans, resistance fighters hiding deep in the forest. They quickly interrogated him, and after realizing he was Soviet, Chirin asked for a radio so he could contact his battalion. Speaking in his native Yakut tongue, he crafted a coded message meant only for Nikolai to understand. He disguised his transmission as a haunting folk tune, the melody strange and unrecognizable to German ears. Sure enough, when the signal was intercepted, Rulich and his men were baffled. To them, it was just noise. Rulich called Schultz into his office, telling him it was time to end this once and for all. Schultz's new mission was to eliminate the Siberian sniper who had humiliated the German army again and again. Though reluctant, Schultz agreed, saying he would take position near the same bridge where Chirin's squad had perished. At the same time, Nikolai relayed grim news from the front. German artillery had arrived, and the panzers were already preparing to move. But no matter how urgent his warning was, it fell on deaf ears. The higher Soviet command no longer trusted Chirin's messages. They believed any information coming from him could be fabricated under German pressure. In reality, Chirin was still fighting, now alongside the partisans. Many of them were former Soviet soldiers, but even so, Moscow saw them as unreliable. Their reports carried no weight. With no reinforcements and no orders, Lieutenant Loboda was forced to come up with a new plan on his own. That night, Chirin was given one final mission: to destroy the bridge beyond the German line, the same bridge where his comrades had been killed. He requested a rifle from the partisans, and outside, one of them prepared the mortar shell he had found earlier, now ready to be used as an explosive charge. As dawn approached, Chirin and the partisans took their positions around the bridge. Ammunition was scarce, as always. This time, Chirin was given only 2 bullets. The rest of the team began crawling forward, planting explosives beneath the structure, while Chirin slipped into the forest to find the perfect vantage point. In the German trenches, the battle had already begun. After the opening barrage, lines of gray-uniformed soldiers advanced from the distance. Their infantry pushed forward confidently, only to be met head-on by the Red Army's fierce defense. Far behind them, a third column of panzers rolled in with arrogance, their metal tracks grinding across the frozen ground, certain that nothing could stop their steel advance. By now, Guryanov was a different man. Gone was his hesitation. He calmly took aim at the MG-42 crew across the field, squeezing the trigger with newfound confidence. His bullet struck the earth just beside them, but he didn't falter. He had finally learned what it meant to fight without fear. Deep in the forest, Schultz had joined the hunt himself, this time with one clear objective: to eliminate the Siberian sniper, Yegor Chirin. He moved carefully, tracking his prey, and soon spotted Chirin firing toward the bridge. The flash of the rifle gave away his position. Schultz crept closer, certain this would be the moment he ended the duel. But once again, it was all a trap. Chirin had set the bait, and Schultz walked straight into it. Realizing too late that he had been fooled again, Schultz turned to fire, but Chirin's shot came first. The German sniper fell. Now only one task remained. The bridge trembled violently under the weight of the approaching tanks. It had to be destroyed before the enemy could cross. At the same time, the Red Army rose from their trenches, charging forward to meet the Germans head-on. With his last bullet, Chirin steadied his aim. He knew this one shot had to count. The trigger clicked, the rifle cracked, and the explosion tore through the bridge. The massive structure collapsed, cutting off the German advance and trapping the panzers where they stood. On the battlefield without their tanks and artillery, the Germans quickly lost ground. The Red Army surged forward, breaking through their trenches in a matter of minutes. When Soviet soldiers stormed the enemy bunker, they found Lieutenant Shagurov inside, calmly shaving his beard, just as he had promised at the start of the campaign. The next morning, as snow began to fall, Chirin finally reunited with his surviving comrades, the men who had endured and lived through the storm. So the moral of the story is, when you only have 2 bullets, bring a mirror, learn a folk song, and somehow it will still be enough.